It was supposed to be just another regular day of shopping. I walked through the sliding glass doors of the department store, my mind focused on picking up a few things I needed for the house. I was dressed casually, jeans, a loose-fitting blouse, and sneakers. Nothing that screamed authority. Nothing that would make anyone take a second look. But that's exactly what happened. As I passed by the clothing racks, I noticed a police officer standing near the entrance, his eyes scanning the crowd. He had that look on his face, like he was trying to piece something together. I didn't think much of it at first. I've always been someone who stays in their lane, minds their own business. But then I felt his gaze lock onto me. I couldn't explain why, but something about the way he stared made my stomach drop. I tried to shrug it off, kept walking, but he started to follow me. At first, it was a subtle thing, but then I realized he was getting closer. Too close. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, his voice stern and commanding. I turned around, trying to mask the surprise that was rising in me. "Yes?" I asked, keeping my voice calm. The officer didn't say anything immediately. Instead, he took a step toward me, his hand resting on his holstered gun. "I need to ask you about an item you've taken," he said, his tone accusing. I felt my heart skip a beat. Taken? What was he talking about? "I haven't taken anything," I said, confused. "You were seen near a display, and now an item is missing. We need to talk." I felt the blood rush to my face as my thoughts began to race. This didn't make sense. I wasn't even near the high-end stuff. I had just picked up some basic kitchen supplies and was heading to the checkout. "You're mistaken," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I haven't stolen anything." He didn't listen. Instead, he moved closer, reaching for my arm. "Let's go talk to the manager." I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't believe this was happening. I could feel his grip tightening on my arm as he led me through the aisles, ignoring my protests. My mind was spinning. This couldn't be happening. I had done nothing wrong. The officer's expression was unmoved, like he had already made up his mind about me. "Just a few questions," he muttered, pulling me past startled shoppers who were eyeing the scene with curiosity. We reached the security office, and he shoved the door open without knocking. Inside, a man in a store uniform looked up from his desk, clearly startled. "What's going on, officer?" the man asked. "This woman," the officer began, his tone still filled with accusation, "was seen near the display, and now we're missing an item. We need to check her bag." The store security guard glanced at me, and I could see the doubt in his eyes. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My thoughts raced. I needed to keep my cool. "Let me see your ID," the officer demanded, ignoring the guard now and focusing entirely on me. I reached for my wallet, hands trembling but still trying to maintain some semblance of composure. As I fumbled to pull out my ID, I heard a voice outside the office, sharp and unmistakable. "Is there a problem here?" The officer and I both turned, and standing in the doorway was another officer. This one wasn't wearing a standard uniform. He was in tactical gear, a helmet tucked under his arm. My stomach sank, but I couldn't help the small sense of relief that began to bubble up. The officer who had been accusing me immediately straightened, his hand dropping from my arm. "Commander," he said, his voice suddenly meek. I stared at him, confused. "Commander? Of what?" The officer in tactical gear stepped into the room, his eyes scanning the situation quickly. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at me, then at the officer who had accosted me. "You've got the wrong person," he said, his voice firm, no room for doubt. "Let her go." The officer who had been holding me glanced between the two of us, his confusion evident. "But she's the SWAT commander," the tactical officer interrupted, his words cutting through the tension like a knife. A silence settled in the room, and I could see the officer's face go pale. My eyes never left the commander's. Something in the air shifted, and for the first time since I'd walked into this store, I felt like I could breathe again. The officer who had grabbed me stumbled backward, eyes wide in disbelief. "Commander?" he repeated, his voice faltering. His posture had gone from firm and accusatory to defensive, almost like a child caught misbehaving. I didn't say anything at first, just stood there, trying to maintain my composure. The sudden recognition from the tactical officer had turned the tables, but there was still a part of me that couldn't quite believe how easily things had shifted. How quickly the dynamics had changed. The commander didn't waste time. He motioned for me to follow him, and I did without hesitation, a sense of authority emanating from his every move. The officer who had stopped me was still standing there, now with his back to the wall, unsure of what to do. His face flushed red, embarrassment and frustration painting his features. As we stepped into the hallway, the commander leaned in slightly, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone softer than before. I nodded, still shaken. "I'm fine. Just shocked, really." He glanced back at the officer, his eyes narrowing. This kind of thing should never happen, not in our city. We continued walking, and I could hear the distant murmur of the store manager's voice behind us, trying to defuse the situation. I was starting to feel the weight of everything sinking in. This officer had just assumed the worst about me, and I had no idea why. We reached the back office, a more secure area, and the commander closed the door behind us. He gestured to a chair and I sat, the adrenaline still pumping through my veins. "You know, you'd think after all this time, people would stop making assumptions," he said, looking directly at me. "But here we are." I met his gaze, my voice finally breaking the tension. "Why would he think I stole anything?" The commander didn't answer right away. Instead, he sat across from me, folding his arms. "Sometimes people let biases cloud their judgment. It's not just about what's visible to the eye, but what they think they know." I took in a deep breath, nodding. I had dealt with assumptions before, just never so blatantly. "And you should know," he added, his voice a little more clipped now, "this isn't the first time I've heard of such an incident. It's happening more than it should." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with a truth that seemed almost too much to bear. "Don't worry," he said, breaking the silence. "I'll make sure this gets handled. No one here should ever be made to feel like that again." I sat in the office, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the only sound breaking the heavy silence between us. My thoughts were racing, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. How had this officer thought it was okay to stop me? To accuse me so easily, based on what? Nothing more than my presence, my appearance. It stung more than I cared to admit. The commander's eyes softened slightly as he observed my quiet contemplation. "I know this isn't easy to process," he said, his tone more empathetic now. "But I want you to know that you're not alone in this. We've got your back." I nodded, but my mind was still swirling. The situation felt surreal. I had spent years serving in the force, gaining the respect of my colleagues, and this was how things were going to go down. Because some officer couldn't be bothered to do his job properly. There was a knock on the door, followed by a brief pause before the commander called out, "Come in." The door opened, and the store manager stepped inside, his face tight with concern. "Commander," he began, "we've checked the security footage. There was no theft. The item wasn't even missing." The commander turned to me, his gaze steady. "There's your answer. But I'm guessing you already knew that." I just sighed, feeling a wave of frustration wash over me. "It's not about the item," I muttered, almost to myself. "It's about the assumption. The fact that he thought I could be guilty without a second thought." The manager glanced nervously between us, then back at the commander. "We're sorry for the trouble this has caused, ma'am," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "I'll make sure it's dealt with internally. It won't happen again." "Make sure it doesn't," the commander replied, his voice firm. "We're not in the business of harassing people." Not in this department. The manager nodded quickly and left, closing the door behind him. I turned back to the commander, still trying to piece together my emotions. I had been humiliated in front of everyone. I had been made to feel like a criminal when I was doing nothing more than minding my own business. "You don't have to worry about him anymore," the commander said, reading my thoughts. "He'll be dealt with." "I just don't understand how it happens so easily," I replied, my voice raw. "It shouldn't be this way. Not for anyone." "I agree," the commander said quietly, his eyes fixed on me. "And I'll make sure it changes. One step at a time." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. I knew I wasn't going to get over this incident right away. But with his words, I felt something shift. For the first time that day, I felt like maybe there was a chance for change. The commander's words lingered in my mind as we sat in that small office. His assurances gave me some comfort, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this incident was a symptom of a much larger issue. The assumption, the prejudice, it was embedded somewhere deep, even if most people didn't realize it. The door opened again, and this time, it was the officer who had accused me. He stepped inside hesitantly, his shoulders slumped, eyes downcast. He looked completely different from the confident officer I had first encountered in the store. Now, he looked like a man who had realized his mistake, and the weight of that realization was clear. "Commander," he started, his voice low, I want to apologize. I didn't mean for this to escalate the way it did." The commander didn't say anything at first. He simply stared at the officer, his gaze cold, calculating. "I'm listening," the commander finally said. I saw her near the display, and I don't know, something just felt off," the officer continued, his words stumbling over each other. "I didn't stop to think. I just acted." The commander leaned back in his chair, clearly disappointed. "You didn't stop to think. That's the problem, isn't it?" His tone was sharp now. "You let your instincts take over without checking the facts, without considering that maybe you were wrong." The officer nodded, his eyes downcast. "I get it now. I shouldn't have assumed. I should have asked more questions before jumping to conclusions." I could feel the anger bubbling up in me again, but I swallowed it down. I wasn't here to get into a shouting match. What had happened, and now, the focus had to shift to making sure it didn't happen again. "You've learned your lesson," the commander said finally. "But you need to do more than apologize. You need to change. You need to learn how to stop seeing people as problems to solve based on what you think you know. You need to take the time to actually see them." The officer nodded again, this time with more resolve. "I will. I swear it." The commander turned to me then, his gaze softening. "And I'm sorry, too. You shouldn't have had to go through this. Not from one of our own." It was the first time all day that I felt like I wasn't just a victim of an isolated incident, but that my experience was being validated. That there was hope for something better. "You know, we don't change things overnight," the commander added, breaking the moment. "But change is possible. It starts here, with us." I stood up, suddenly feeling the weight of the conversation lift off my shoulders. "I'm just glad this is over," I said, giving the officer one last glance before walking toward the door. The commander followed me, his voice stopping me just before I left. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to call. We've got your back." I gave him a small nod, finally feeling a sense of relief. Maybe I'd been right to think that not all hope was lost. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. For all of us. I stepped out of the office, the weight in my chest slowly starting to lift as I made my way back to the front of the store. The atmosphere outside that small room was starkly different from what I had just experienced. The air felt clearer, lighter. The tension that had been so thick earlier was now dissipating, but the sting of the situation still lingered. As I walked toward the front doors, I could hear the murmurs of the store employees, now realizing what had just happened. The officer who had accused me earlier had already gone, his presence replaced by the quiet of the usual shopping day. I stepped outside, greeted by the cool air, and felt a mix of exhaustion and relief wash over me. I hadn't been in a situation like that in years. The last time I felt so publicly vulnerable was during my early days in the force, but even then, I had more control, more understanding of what was happening around me. Today, I had been blindsided. Not by the accusation, but by the quickness with which it was made. By the ease with which someone could assume the worst of me, based on nothing but their perception. I reached my car, and just as I was about to get in, I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was the commander, stepping out into the parking lot behind me. "You okay?" he asked, his voice calm but concerned. I turned around and nodded. "Yeah," I replied, though the feeling of being violated still hadn't fully passed. "I'm just ready to go home." "I get that," he said, his expression softening. "Listen, I want to remind you, this isn't over. There's work to be done. I'll be keeping track of the changes we discussed, and I expect you to as well. You're part of this, too." I raised an eyebrow, unsure of what he meant. "What changes?" He smiled slightly. "Making sure things like this don't happen again. I know you've got the experience, and I want you to use it. You've got a voice, and you've earned the right to speak up. We can't change things if we stay silent." I felt a small spark of hope in me, something I hadn't felt in a while. "I'll do my part," I said, my voice more firm now. The commander gave me a nod of approval. "Good. And just remember, no matter what happens, you're not alone in this." I watched him walk back toward the entrance of the store, his tall frame fading into the distance. For the first time today, I felt a little less burdened by the weight of everything that had happened. As I got into my car and drove away, I reflected on everything that had transpired. It had been a rough day, one filled with unfair assumptions and unpleasant surprises, but maybe, just maybe, it was also a reminder. A reminder that change starts with the people who are willing to stand up and fight, no matter how small the victory may seem. And as I turned onto the highway, I knew that I wasn't just going to let this incident slide. It had already pushed me to my limits, but it also sparked a fire in me. A fire that would carry me forward, not only as a commander but as someone who had the power to make things right. One step at a time. The next morning, I woke up early, the cool morning air filling the room as the sun barely peeked over the horizon. It was strange, after everything that had happened, I expected to feel exhausted, defeated. But instead, I felt determined. I took a deep breath, still reflecting on the events from the day before. I was back in my routine now, but there was a shift in me, something I hadn't anticipated. I'd gone from being a passive observer of injustice to someone who had to confront it head-on. I wasn't just going to let that moment fade into the background. It was a call to action, a reminder of how fragile things could be, how easily assumptions could ruin a person's life. I had a few calls to make. The first was to my team. I called them into the office, gathered around the table like we had done so many times before, but this time it was different. There was something new in the air, something urgent. "We've got work to do," I began, my voice steady, but with an edge that was unfamiliar to me. The events from the store still loomed over my thoughts, but I wasn't going to let them control me. This isn't just about making sure we're the best at what we do. It's about making sure we're also holding ourselves and each other accountable. Yesterday, I saw a breakdown in judgment that I don't want to see again. And I don't care who it is, whether it's a rookie or a seasoned officer, we need to do better. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of my words sinking in. My team wasn't used to hearing me speak like this, but I could see the shift in their expressions. They were paying attention now. They were listening. "We can't afford to be complacent," I continued. "We're in a position of trust, and that means we need to be conscious of how we interact with the community. People are watching, and they have every right to expect better from us." One of the senior officers, a man I'd worked with for years, spoke up. We've always been about integrity, Commander. If this is something we need to address as a team, then we'll do it. I nodded, grateful for the support. Good. I'm not here to point fingers. I'm here to make sure this doesn't happen again. We're going to take responsibility for what happened, and we're going to make sure it's clear that no one is above being held accountable. Not me, not anyone. I paused, my eyes scanning the room. I've already started working on some training materials to help with this. I want everyone to be on the same page, understanding the consequences of snap judgments. We're going to talk about biases, both conscious and unconscious, and how they impact our decision-making. There was a low murmur of agreement around the table. I could see the gears turning in their minds. They were processing what I was saying, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was actually making a difference. As the meeting broke up, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I had been thrust into a situation that no one should ever have to face, but I wasn't going to let it be for nothing. I had the power to change things, to ensure that this was the last time someone would feel unjustly accused. The days that followed were filled with the kind of work that didn't let up, preparing new training sessions, meeting with department heads, and strategizing on how to make sure what had happened to me never happened again. I wasn't doing it for myself anymore, though. I wasn't doing it for the apology or the recognition. I was doing it for anyone who had ever been wrongfully accused or overlooked. But even as I threw myself into the task, there were moments when my mind would drift back to that day in the store. The officer's accusation still felt like a raw wound, one I wasn't sure would ever fully heal. No matter how much I told myself it wasn't personal, that it was just a product of his ignorance, there was still something that gnawed at me. Then, one afternoon, as I was wrapping up some final details for the training program, my phone buzzed. I glanced down at the screen, an unfamiliar number, but something told me it was important. I answered. "Commander, it's Officer Richardson," the voice on the other end said, his tone tense but respectful. "I need to speak with you." I took a deep breath. Richardson. The officer who had stopped me that day. For a second, my stomach flipped, but I kept my voice even. "What's going on, officer?" He paused, as though he was unsure how to continue. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. About what happened with you, about how I acted. And I want to apologize again. But I also need to do more than that." His words took me by surprise. He sounded different. Almost like he was carrying a burden that wasn't his alone. It wasn't just the simple apology I had expected. "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning back in my chair, my curiosity piqued. "I've been talking to a few people, senior officers, the department heads, and they've agreed to let me sit in on some of your training sessions. I want to understand what went wrong, really understand it, so I don't make the same mistake again." I didn't know what to say at first. This wasn't something I had anticipated. A part of me wanted to be angry, to remind him of how his actions had impacted me. But another part, the part that wanted real change, was intrigued. Maybe this was the sign of progress I had been hoping for. "I'm glad to hear that," I said, finally finding my voice. "But it's not just about the training. It's about changing the way we think. I don't want you to just listen to the material. I want you to reflect on your own actions, on why you jumped to conclusions." There was a pause before Richardson spoke again. "I know. And I will. I don't want to let this go. I want to do better." "Then show me," I replied, my voice firm. "Not just to me, but to everyone you work with. Prove that you've learned something from this. Actions speak louder than words." "Understood, Commander. I'll prove it." After I hung up, I sat in silence for a few moments. A strange mixture of satisfaction and wariness settled in me. This was a step forward, but it was just one step. There was still a long road ahead. But it was a start. As the weeks passed, Richardson kept his word. He showed up at the training sessions, listening intently, asking questions, engaging in discussions about bias, assumptions, and how those elements could shape our interactions with the public. He wasn't just there physically, he was truly trying to understand the depths of what had happened. And as much as it was hard to admit, part of me started to believe he was sincere. But change doesn't happen overnight. The department had a long road ahead of it. Every shift, every new case, brought with it another opportunity to practice the lessons we were learning, to see if they had truly taken hold. And while I saw progress in the officers around me, I knew there would always be more work to do. One moment of growth didn't erase years of ingrained behavior, but it was something to build on. One late afternoon, I was at my desk when the door to my office opened. It was Richardson again, but this time, he wasn't in uniform. He was dressed casually, his usual stern demeanor replaced by a hint of nervousness. He stood there for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to speak, before he finally stepped forward. "Commander," he began, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. "I wanted to thank you." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely curious. "For what?" "For pushing me," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "For making me face what I did. For making me realize that what happened to you could have been so much worse for someone else. I'm not proud of how I acted, but I'm proud of how I've learned since. And I'm not going to stop here." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of his words settling in. I knew it wasn't an easy thing for him to admit. It wasn't easy for anyone, really. But it was a sign that change was possible, even if it was hard-fought. "You're doing the right thing," I said simply. "But don't stop. This isn't something you fix just for yourself. You fix it for everyone you work with. For everyone you serve." He nodded, his expression serious. "I know. And I will." We stood in silence for a moment, both of us letting the gravity of the situation settle around us. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. It wasn't a story of instant redemption. But it was a beginning. A beginning of something real, something that could ripple out and make a difference in ways we couldn't yet predict. As he left my office, I sat back in my chair, the weight of everything that had happened still fresh in my mind. The store incident, the apology, the months of work to change the culture within the department, it was all a reminder that change requires action. Real, tangible action. It doesn't happen because we want it to. It happens because we fight for it, every day, even when it feels like nothing is changing. But change was happening. Slowly, but surely. I had made it through one of the toughest moments of my career, and I had emerged stronger for it. And with that strength, I knew I could face whatever came next. Not just as a commander, but as someone who knew what it truly meant to stand up for what was right.